I'm Alexis Clark at Washington University in St. Louis, and I'm joined today by Frances Fowle of the National Galleries of Scotland and University of Edinburgh, and Marnin Young of Yeshiva University. We're here today to discuss Impressionism and the social history of art, but before that, I hope that we could each introduce ourselves, our research, and say a bit about our interest in this topic. Frances, let's start with you.
Okay, hi, I'm Frances Fowle, and I'm Reader in History of Art at the University of Edinburgh, and I'm also Senior Curator of French Art at the Scottish National Gallery. And in my capacity as an academic, I have looked largely at, kind of away from mainstream Impressionism towards the periphery. I'm really interested in the impact of the art market in particular on countries where Impressionism was widely collected, but also looking at how artists responded to the work that they were able to see. And so my main kind of monograph was on the Scottish art dealer Alexander Reid, and he was one of the first dealers to sell Impressionism on a regular basis in Britain. And this had a huge impact on Scottish painting, so that's something which it's one area I've looked at. But I'm also interested in the kind of networks established between dealers, collectors, artists, critics, and how that sort of impacts the Impressionist narrative.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Marnin?
I'm Marnin Young. I'm a professor of art history at Yeshiva University in New York. I recently published a book called Realism in the Age of Impressionism, Painting in the Politics of Time, which treats a series of 5 painters who I see as closely related to, but not exactly coterminous with Impressionism in the late 1870s and 1880s. I'm interested in histories of temporality and their representation in art, and that has been something I've been concerned with for quite some time. The book grew out of my PhD dissertation, which I completed at the University of California, Berkeley, under T.J. Clark's supervision. So my interest in the conjunction of Impressionism and social art history goes back a very long way, but I should say that my own scholarly work is often sort of tangentially concerned with Impressionism. I see Impressionism as a sort of necessary antagonist in some senses to the kinds of art that I'm interested in. I'm also interested in sort of peripheral figures who are tangentially related to Impressionism and not necessarily at the core of things, although I have written about Degas.
All right. I suppose I should explain my own research interests. So my work primarily concerns museum and exhibition histories with a specific interest in narratologies of modern art that are promulgated at those exhibitions. I'm very much interested in how these narratives correspond to exhibition spaces. And the topic of my manuscript to that effect is on the Luxembourg Museum in France. I'm looking at that museum and how it works to narrate a history of art predicated upon an aesthetics of eclecticism and, I think, a politics of solidarism. I want to start by talking with you, Marnin, about your research in realism in the age of Impressionism. That book really fascinated me because I think that it holds so much promise for troubling the way in which histories of 19th century art have been really written with an emphasis on classification schemes and taxonomies, often very simple taxonomies, it seems to me. Right. But that book, I think you're really working through how to rethink time, how to rethink the way in which we connect these time periods to these movements, and you're working to sort of push realism into decades that we so often conflate with Impressionism, the 1870s and the 1880s.
Right.
I see in your introduction that you're also interested in the social history of art, in this Clarkian social history of art in which you were trained, and thinking about that in conjunction with Michael Fried's work. I wondered whether you could speak to how you see Fried and Clark working together, or maybe even working against one another.
Right. Now, I would want to see them as working together, at least in my own work. So I think I need to say a little bit about the project. It is about painting and time, the representation of time, but also the relationship, as you suggest, to the temporalities of the 19th century, the transformation and the cultural and practical understandings of time. So there are really two things going on. The first was a challenge, how to talk about time in paintings as a formal component of those works. It's something that is treated sort of passingly in much of the art historical literature, but it's not part of our toolbox. It's not a tool that we use on a regular basis to talk about the representations of time and how works of art have a temporality. So that was the first task I set myself, is to actually develop a vocabulary for talking about how paintings specifically represent and image a certain kind of temporality. Mm-hmm. And I can't think of any other art historian who has done more for thinking about how time works in works of art than Michael Fried. And so my interest in Michael Fried grew directly out of a sort of practical problem of how to talk about the representation of time in works of art. And I've recently published a little article about this, just to sort of make it clear what I think Michael Fried has done for our understanding of time in the visual arts. So that was the first task. And then, of course, the second task was trying to situate all of this specific representation of time in realist paintings and impressionist paintings in relationship to the very well-established cultural transformation of temporality in the 19th century. Cultural historians have written about this for 100 years, maybe more, about how our notions of time have agglomerated around the clock, the railroad, the international system. So it was a project of bringing these two things together. So Clark and Fried seemed like an obvious fit together, but I do think that they are more complementary than many methodological accounts seem to imply. I would refer people to some recent publications by the philosopher Robert Pippin, who has argued very persuasively that both Clark and Fried are conscious of and responding to a kind of post-Hegelian situation in late 19th century, which boils down to the basic problem of how is it possible to look at a work of art in modernity? How is that possible anymore? So I do think they work very closely together, and in some senses my task in the book was to find a way to make social history still a viable practice. And so I was very excited to take part in this questionnaire and in this interview, because I do think that that's something that I do care about, but I don't think it can just go on the way that it's been going on for many years.
Yes, and I think that that's a topic that we really need to get to, is what is to be done with the social history of art into the future. But before we get there, I wanted to speak to Frances a bit about your work. And so many of your exhibitions, Frances, have explored Impressionism from very different angles, from the study of Impressionism in the United States, the recent exhibition on American Impressionism, Van Gogh in Britain, and then Impressionism and environmentalism. I wondered whether you could speak to how the social history of art has impacted the curation of exhibitions related to Impressionism, maybe to trace the past, present, and future of the social history of art as it relates to these exhibitions.
Yes, and that's quite a big question, really, isn't it? But I think it's interesting that looking at the kind of trend, there has been a trend towards social art history since the 1980s. And I mean, I try to think about it, and there's always a tendency initially for these big monographic shows. There always has been a tendency for monographic shows, but the way that they've been treated has changed over time. And there's been an opportunity to focus on more peripheral artists. Well, not really peripheral artists, but artists who were mainstream in the Impressionist narrative, such as Gustav Caillebotte. And I was interested that three of the essayists noted the impact on Caillebotte, on our kind of reassessment of Caillebotte in the as a kind of reaction to social art history, was an outcome of social art history, I should say. Also, artists like Morisot and Cassatt have definitely kind of come to the fore since the dawn of social art history, because Ribald, in his history of Impressionism, effectively wrote them out of that story. There was a kind of move towards these kind of monographic stroke thematic exhibitions. So you have dug out the races, dug out the ballet. Recently we've had the Seurat and the Parade de Cirque exhibition at the Met, which completely looks at Seurat in the context of the socio-political context, or socio-political history at the time. And of course that's a move again in the direction of not just a monographic show, but it's a work which focuses on, an exhibition that focuses on an individual work. Another impact, I think, of social art history was to produce these exhibitions which focused on the origins of Impressionism, and also, again, figures who were associated with Impressionism or who exhibited with the group, the Société des Artistes Indépendants, at the so-called Impressionist exhibitions, but who, again, we tend to forget about. The most recent example of that is the Basile exhibition, because he didn't exhibit at the Impressionist exhibitions, but he was kind of associated with the group, and that's a kind of interesting take that he's marketed, if you like, as a mainstream Impressionist, when in fact he wasn't really at all, because he died so young. There have also been these thematic shows, for example, Impressionists in the Sea, Impressionist Gardens, Impressionism and Fashion, and one kind of, one wonders if the subject matter at that point, the kind of social context, socio-political context, is taking over from the artists. They're almost incidental. And there's definitely been a move at places like the Musée d'Orsay away from kind of mainstream Impressionism towards a much broader embrace of French art at the end of the 19th century. So a good example is the Splendeur et Misère exhibition focusing on prostitution, where you have artists like Manet and Degas included, but also people like Béraud, Jean Béraud, people who are kind of foreign, and then obviously Toulouse-Lautrec, and it just has a kind of broader remit, and it's looking at Impressionism in the context of this wider history. I suppose one other thing I wanted to note was the opening of the Musée des Impressionism in 2009, because that is an example of a museum which is dedicated solely to Impressionism and how it's kind of dealt with that. There is a definite move by that museum, again, away from sort of mainstream Impressionists, what one might describe as mainstream Impressionists, although they had a recent exhibition on Degas. But they've had exhibitions on American Impressionism, which I participated in, and also on Belgian Impressionism, with Brussels as a kind of centre of Impressionism, and as well as artists like Bonnard, who one wouldn't normally categorise as an Impressionist, or Caillebotte, etc. So it's kind of interesting the direction it's taken. With all these exhibitions, really, they're underpinned by an interest in, or this kind of impulse of social art history, but there have been moments of interruption. A noticeable moment was when Richard Brettel curated the Painting Quickly exhibition in 2000, and that was an attempt to kind of bring everything back to the materiality, to technique, to I suppose the pre-T.J. Clark era, and it caused quite a flurry at the time. There was a conference, and it took place at the National Gallery in London, and there was a definite divide at that time between those who saw themselves as social art historians and those who were more the kind of object-based art historians, I suppose. And I do remember, I remember Richard Kendall standing up and speaking on behalf of the latter.
So this is very, you have so much to say, and there's so much to unpack here. I wondered whether, Francis, for your part, you ever see these exhibitions entitled Impressionism, for instance, the Basile exhibition that you referenced. Is Impressionism simply a word to lure a paying public into these museums? Is it some type of slogan, basically, that can be used as a marketing tool? Is that what Impressionism has been reduced to by some of these exhibitions, or do you think that there is more, I don't know if we want to say, sort of curatorial integrity around this interest in Impressionism?
I think I think there is a definite perception that that's the case, and to a certain extent it is the case. I can give a couple of examples, but so, for example, we did an exhibition, monographic. We started off as a monographic exhibition on Daubigny, Charles-François Daubigny. This was last year at the National Galleries, and the Taft Museum in Cincinnati they kind of initiated the idea, and they really wanted to focus on Daubigny per se. But it was felt by the team that was involved in that, it was actually a collaboration between the Taft Van Gogh Museum and the National Galleries of Scotland, that Daubigny was an artist that the general public was not familiar with, and that we needed to kind of introduce them in a soft way. Mm-hmm. So to show him and his impact, or show him in conjunction with Monet and Van Gogh, Monet, Pissarro, Sisley, with the Impressionists, to show how much impact he had on the Impressionists, how important he was for Impressionism. Mm-hmm. And so the exhibition was marketed as inspiring Impressionism. Yes. So there was and in fact, but then you see the danger is then that people assume that Daubigny was an Impressionist. Yes. So there is this problem. Also, same with American Impressionism and British Impressionism. Mm-hmm. So when we did the American Impressionist exhibition at it was in Edinburgh and Giverny, and also went to the Thyssen in Madrid. Mm-hmm. There was a real anxiety around the title of the exhibition. And the French authorities, the French Réunion des Musées Nationaux, the kind of representatives of the Musée d'Orsay, etc., were not happy for it to be called l'impressionnisme américain, because there is no such thing, as far as they're concerned. There is only French Impressionism. There's a real kind of status anxiety associated with French Impressionism and its relationship with these wider Impressionisms. Having said that, I mean, I worked on an exhibition, both on the American Impressionism exhibition and another one which was focused on British Impressionism. And of course, the expression Impressionism was used in such a broad sense at the end of the 19th century, and that's something which I was really keen for people to address, for the public to engage with. So the public were willing, I think, to learn about these kind of broader definitions of Impressionism, but the critics weren't. And so the criticism of both those exhibitions was the problem of juxtaposing kind of higher quality, as they perceived, works by French artists and lesser works by these other Impressionists, these non-mainstream Impressionists.
Yes, I think that this is a real issue for us right now, trying to think through the global, the national, and the local insofar as we study Impressionism. And when I read through the responses to the questionnaire, I can't help but think of Emily Burns' response, where she very much discusses how Impressionism was elastic as a concept in the 19th century, but since then has really shrunk, or at least momentarily has shrunk, to mean simply French Impressionism, to the exclusion of these other understandings of Impressionism worldwide. So I think that that's important for us to keep in mind. Francis, one other question about that earlier response. Do you think that there is any move away from the social history of art in curatorial circles? Do you see an embrace of other theories or other methods for approaching this art, or is social history here to stay when it comes to the curatorial exhibition?
I think it's difficult to say moving away. I mean, there is I think there's an impulse. I noticed again in the questionnaires, there's impulse towards returning back to the object, and I think curators instinctively feel that pull. I mean, I'm interested in how, for example, you can incorporate, and this again is very much looking at the art object, how you can construct an exhibition around the idea of the object and the way it was, it was being not just created for a local market, but was then also being exported, and then the impact that had on the country that it went to. So, for example, one of the first exhibitions I thought was quite interesting that did that was the Eric Hirschler's exhibition called Impressionism Abroad, and it was on collectors in Boston, and collectors not just of Impressionist art, but of late 19th century French art, including kind of earlier artists like the Barbizon School, and also naturalism, and the impact that it had not only on kind of taste in Boston, but also on American artists and how they responded. And so that's something which I myself tried to explore in my own work, particularly in the exhibition I did on Impressionism in Scotland. But again, we have this anxiety around hanging a work by a Scottish artist next door to a French artist. So one of the critical responses was, it's like if you hang if you hang a work by J.D. Ferguson, who's one of the Scottish colourists, beside Cézanne, it's like hanging a cup of sweet tea beside a fine glass of Chardonnay. So there is always this tendency among critics to look at work still with this kind of aesthetic judgment, cast their aesthetic eye on the works, and so they are still really looking at, they're receiving these exhibitions in a, like almost formalist way. And people can walk through exhibitions without even reading the interpretation. They just look at the pictures.
Yes.
And, a really good example of that, I think, is Inventing Impressionism, the exhibition on Duranville, which I thought was a wonderful show. It was interesting that in Paris they showed the dealer's stock books and the kind of paraphernalia of the dealer, and you really kind of got to think about the mechanisms of the art market. Whereas when it was shown in London, they took all that out. I mean, they stripped it out. They did show reproductions of Duranville's Salon, where he brought his clients. But you could walk through that show and you could just think, oh, these are lots of lovely pictures that this dealer handled, and learn nothing at all. So there is a problem with how you interpret an exhibition, within the exhibition, how you interpret it for the public, and how much they're actually receiving beyond this kind of formalist response.
Yeah. I wonder, from speaking about an exhibition public, if we might think about students, a different public that we serve in the classroom. And I want to speak with Marnan about this point that you raise in your footnote, that some textbooks of 19th century art history have simply taken the social history of art to be the expected approach, that it's not an approach that you need to introduce students so much as you can simply assume that they understand without explanation. And I wondered what that does to the social history of art if we assume that our students already know about this approach. Does it make the social history of art less innovative or less theoretical, maybe even less important as a theory?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question. And in the footnote, I actually start out by citing two exhibition catalogs that also take that presumption. And Francis has already mentioned one of them, Impressionism and Fashion. So I think the problem that was just raised, this question of the split between a social historical account of works that curators seem to be interested in, textbook authors, and we academic scholars also seem interested, and the public's tendency sometimes to gloss over that and just go right to the works and think about the quality of the works. And this is something the critical reception of current exhibitions focuses on. But I don't think it's a problem that can just be sort of dismissed. It's a endemic, I call it an existential problem in art history, that we don't really have a full-blown account of how it is that the works of art that we appreciate, value, think are the fine Chardonnay, are the fine Chardonnay, and how it is that social history does anything to explain that or to respond to that problem, an aesthetic problem, I guess. Sometimes in class I will say, that's a problem for the aesthetic philosophers to deal with. We're just going to talk about history here. And so I think that is one problem that the assumption of a social historical approach to art really raises. And it's a problem that canon formation and the critiques of the canon over the last 30, 40 years, the exclusion of artists who are women, the exclusion of people of color from the canon, has pushed us into a position. I don't think it's necessarily unfortunate, but it's a problematic position in which we bracket the question of aesthetic evaluation when we're teaching or writing about the history of art. And I frankly think that's something that actually goes on all the time. We art historians are constantly evaluating the aesthetic quality of works of art and deciding to write about or not write about works of art based on our sense of whether they are good artists or good works of art. And I don't think that's something that we should necessarily shy away from treating, but I frankly don't have any account of how it is that we bridge those things. It's a problem that I think is really, really deep. It's a philosophical problem that we should probably talk about more, treat more seriously, but at this point in time, I don't think I have too much to say about it. Now, the question you're really posing is, what's so wrong with taking social history as the starting point of a textbook account of any 19th century period that we're talking about, Impressionism specifically? I think there are really two omissions from what I would call a textbook social history of art that need to be taken more seriously. And one of them is sort of generally speaking the problem of style. And I don't just mean that kind of Rick Rattel, go back to how things used to be, approach to a formalist account of Impressionism, but rather to treat style as historical. And this is something I care very deeply about, and it's something that some art historians, I think, do almost unconsciously take very seriously. But there are meanings to style. Impressionism was a meaningful style. The abbreviated brushstroke, the perceived acceleration of the production of a work of art, the replacement of the finished tableau with a sketch. These are things that have meaning, and I think through it, all sort of major conjunctions of the history of art. It's true in the 18th century, it's true in the 20th century. The formal innovations are maybe the most important meaningful component of a work of art. And I think that some art historians have tried to steer us away from old school formalism towards what might be called post-formalism, in a way of treating the visual configurations of physical objects as historical. The iconography of a work of art is obviously historical, but how it is built, how it's produced, is something that we can treat as part of the social history. So a social history of style, to borrow a phrase from Michael Baxendale, would be something that I wished more art historians and certainly textbooks would treat seriously. It's a hard thing to do. I do think it's something that would make social history much more powerful. The second omission is maybe a little less subtle, but it's the way that I perceive the best kinds of writings within the social history as treating works of art not as passive reproductions or recorders of a social moment or historical moment, but rather as agents within a historical moment, as actually doing something in history, at least intended to do something. Even if they fail, the failure to do something is part of the interest we have as historians. And I think this is what Tim Clark's art history consistently has shown as the core concern, to show how David in 1793 or Courbet in 1851 or Manet in 1865 was doing something, saying something, provoking, not just showing something about the world, but doing something to the world. So those two things are consistent omissions from standard social history in exhibitions and textbooks, and many academic art historians as well tend to avoid treating these questions, and that's something that I think we could be well served to treat seriously.
Francis, do you have a response to that, since Marnan raises this point about exhibitions?
Yeah, it is tricky. I mean, I think with exhibitions, we always have to avoid the problem of being too didactic in an exhibition. And actually, it is. I think probably the simplest way to entice the public is through comparative materials such as photography, or through actual, through objects, related objects. Again, I think that the Splendeur et Misère exhibition is a very good example of how that can be done. And so you're actually you do it in a soft way, but you make them, but as long as the material is kind of it somehow enhancing what you're seeing and kind of adding to what you're seeing, it can be actually really incredibly enticing and productive. So, I mean, one of the things I was thinking about in that exhibition in particular was these registers. They had these registers of prostitutions, and they had these rather sort of horrific photographs of some of the disease that these prostitutes were suffering from, which is something which in a more kind of aesthetically oriented exhibition would have certainly been glossed over, and they weren't afraid to show that kind of material. So there are ways of addressing these issues. And actually, I was also impressed by the fact, I think you have to gauge your city and your audience if you're going to do something like that, because I was impressed by the fact that it didn't cause any particular shock, either in the press reception or in the kind of visitor comments book, because I actually went and had a look through to see, because something we certainly wouldn't be able to do in Edinburgh. So Paris is a more, I suppose Paris and Amsterdam you see as being more kind of enlightened cities maybe. But yeah, so it depends on your audience, I think.
Marnin, you raise this point that maybe Clarkian history is really sort of interested in art that doesn't simply passively reflect its time, but that acts and speaks as an active agent in that moment. And you raise these examples of David, and I think you said Manet as well as Cézanne. These are people who are a part of the canon of 19th century art. Do you think that all works of art produced in the 19th century can sort of endure or can take this Clarkian approach? Is it right to interpret other examples of art or visual culture through Clarkian social history, or does that only work for some works of art and some artists?
What a question. I think it can work for all works of art. It depends whether you have the resources to make the case. I think the proof of the pudding is in the eating, and I've tried to concoct something on what were and maybe are considered minor artists like Jean-François Raffaelli, and to give an account of how he is not only representing poverty and dispossession and crisis, but also intervening within a culture of temporality and offering critical alternatives to dominant modes of understanding of time. So whether he's successful or not is maybe another question, but I do think that works of art should be understood as made to be beheld. They're made to do something to someone at a certain moment in time, and what those audiences are and what those artists' intentions are part of the task of historical recuperation of the meaning of works of art. So I don't think there's any sort of obvious a priori exclusion going on here. Any work of art is potentially understandable as an agent within its historical moment. And even the most conservative and naturalistic art of the 19th century did a certain kind of job of normalization, a certain kind of job of propping up the aesthetic standards of the day, of sort of giving pleasure to the bourgeoisie. It's not necessarily interesting what job works of art did in the past, but I think all works of art should be understood as agents, not merely as recorders. I think that's almost an absurd kind of position to adopt, that works of art record or passively represent. And I'm not sure anyone actually go out on a limb defending that position. So I don't think there's any a priori canon. I think the work of Francis Haskell, for example, years and years ago, has demonstrated that all sorts of canonical formations rise and fall and disintegrate, and who are going to be the artists that matter to us in 100 years is not something that we can predict at this moment in time. Although I would say art historians and exhibitions in particular, I think, do a historical job today of producing the notions and values that continue to inform our decisions about what our works matter. And that's one of the things that interests me in my own work, is how is it that critics and the public and gallery exhibitions, how did these institutions and practices produce the major artists of their own day, and how did those major artists disappear? I mean, the case of Raffaelli is fascinating, and I think Francis is interested in this as well. The question of how Raffaelli or Guillemin were considered to be major artists in their own time. Critics took them very seriously. They were core members of the Impressionist group. And then by the late 20th century, they're all but forgotten. And some of us art historians are interested in these figures, but it's hard sometimes to sell them back to the public today, because the canon has been formed. And I'm interested in that quality of how critics and publics did historically do their job of picking and choosing.
Yeah. Studying the Luxembourg Museum with all of these works of art and artists that have since been forgotten or sidelined, I very much sympathize with that position that I think we all share here. But that does lead me back to Francis's response, where you highlight these three areas for new research, areas which I see really enmeshed. Understudied Impressionists, people like Raffaelli who did participate in these exhibitions, and then, of course, the art market and the global circulation of art. And I wondered whether you could speak to how we can see these three areas as intertwined, as enmeshed. How do they work together?
Well, it's tricky, isn't it? I mean, because I think it works for this idea of art being the art market, and the proliferation of Impressionist art, and then the impact on the artists in whichever country it ends up in. So, I mean, you get that. I mean, I've already spoken a little bit about the impact in Scotland, for example, so or in Britain as a whole, I mean, it's a different story in Scotland than in England, actually, funny enough, you believe it or not. So Scotland was, at the end of the 19th century, was a major industrial centre, and so that this market, what I find absolutely fascinating, the market and the enabling of this kind of influence can only happen against the background of a strong economic sort of underpinning. And so at the end of the 19th century, you get this the growth of various industries and the rise of a new type of collector who is not only able to afford, who is daring enough to buy Impressionist art, which was seen at that time as very kind of avant-garde, but it will also support local artists, and then the two kind of come together. And it's interesting that the story in Britain is slightly different from the story in America, where in Britain, certainly in Scotland, the artists were prepared to support the local artists initially, which is not surprising really. And through seeing how these artists themselves were responding to Impressionist art, they developed a taste for Impressionism and began to buy Impressionist paintings. Whereas in America, it's kind of the other way around. They were sort of, they seem to be prepared to buy either one or the other. And very often the artists themselves were the agents. They were the ones who enabled the purchase of avant-garde art. But you see people like these Bostonian collectors, for example, buying works by Monet, and it's only after they've bought work by Monet that they then will buy works by people like Charles Hassan. And you think that this is bizarre, that's the wrong way around. So the story's not as cut and dried and as simple as you'd expect it to be, and it's quite rather fascinating. But I think it'd be worth exploring that kind of impact in a country like Germany. So Germany was one of the first countries to embrace Impressionism, French Impressionism. And there was a very kind of buoyant market, people like the dealer Paul Cassira. And so to my knowledge, there's never been an attempt to kind of bring the two together. So that's a direction one could look in and look at the impact of local artists. I mean, there is a tendency, I've noticed it in recent years, for this move away from, I mean, I think I've talked about this already, but from mainstream Impressionism. So you've got this movement, for example, at the National Gallery in London, that they're no longer necessarily buying or championing French Impressionism, partly because of the current price of Impressionist paintings, but they are buying what one might describe as American Impressionist artists. Well, someone like Bellows I wouldn't describe as an Impressionist, but he's being sort of repackaged, if you like, for the public, and hangs in the Impressionist galleries at the National Gallery, alongside works by Monet, Degas, etc., and which I find interesting. They've also been moving towards Nordic painting, and they began by buying works by Hammershøi, or a particularly lovely work by Galen Kallela, and they are also just recently they were loaned work and struck by Australian Impressionists, and then staged the Australian Impressionist exhibition kind of as a response to that. So what I find interesting is that their whole kind of buying policy ties into their exhibiting patterns as well. And there's this move, just as there's a move away from kind of mainstream Impressionism, there's a move in their buying policy that it's also it's reflected in their exhibition program.
So each of you have advised undergraduate and graduate students, and I wondered, say some smart, enterprising undergraduate comes to you and wants to study Impressionism in the future. Would you advise them to take on as, say, a thesis or a dissertation topic? What areas of research do you think will be important in the future? And I'll throw this to Marnan first, I suppose.
Well, it was interesting how many of the respondents to the questionnaire agreed about the interest in the global Impressionism, and I think that is an area of study. In a very much more limited way, I've been interested in the relations between French and Belgian art of the 1870s and 1880s, and I think there's a lot more to be said in that case and lots of other cases, Germany, Australia, America, Britain. There's still not only local histories to be written, but also histories of the global networks of exhibitions, of dealing, collecting. They tie these things together in the ways that, in a peculiar way, Impressionism is the first international style of art. And I think that's something that can be treated as a broader problem in world history of how global culture works. So I think there's lots in that respect to be done. I'm fascinated with exhibition histories. I think one of the real significant aspects of Impressionism for art history is understanding the transformation of exhibition histories away from the state and elites to a mass market, and the emergence of the gallery dealer system in the late 19th century is still, I think, in need of revision. We're sort of still depending on 60-year-old accounts of the general structure of that dynamic. So I think there's more there to be said. But I would also, I would encourage a graduate student to take on the canonical artists, but to treat them, again, in a way that I would call post-formalist, treating Impressionist techniques, styles, modes of beholding, modes of, for example, positing the artist as a participant in the spatial configurations of the representation, as someone in the painting, as a historical problem. And these are things that we're not really, with social history or with formalism, able to talk about. So I think we're beginning to develop vocabularies outside of Impressionism or Impressionist studies that might enable us to come back to artists like Monet, Renoir, or even Cézanne, and to rethink some of the assumptions we have based on a kind of Roger Fry, Clement Greenberg formalism that doesn't actually explain what's interesting and peculiar and challenging and new about Impressionist paintings.
Mm-hmm. Frances, for you?
Well, I mean, I have a couple of students actually now who are working on the art market. Surprise, surprise. But I think it's this is a kind of, it's not really an emerging area, but it's an area which has been kind of growing, but which has suddenly has been embraced by economists rather than just art historians, and so it's a real growth area in that respect. And a lot of researchers now are interested in that kind of intersection between economics and art history. But there's still the other thing that's happened recently is the digitization of dealer archives. So we've got archives, or the Goupil archives, been available for some time, but there's a recent announcement the Wildenstein archive would be made available, and the Nerdler archive was also only recently kind of came to light. And then we've got the Agnews archive too, which is at the National Gallery in London. So there are infinite possibilities for new researchers because of the existence of these dealer archives. And so, I mean, that's obviously incredibly important. But I think it's also a way of refreshing and invigorating Impressionist studies, because there's always been a kind of tendency, I find, in art historical accounts to sort of shy away from the idea of the artist as commercially orientated. But I mean, someone like Monet was obviously quite aware of or conscious of where he placed his work, and one could revisit several of the Impressionists, I think, in that sort of light. I think there's also room to develop along these peripheral Impressionists. I mean, we mentioned Guillaume. He's an artist I would really like to see more research on. There is a problem again with availability of archival information, because the correspondence is with the family, and so that's one of the reasons why his work isn't better known, I think. Quite apart from the fact that he's kind of falls between two stools. He's neither an Impressionist nor a Fauve, or rather he kind of gravitates or graduates very swiftly from one to the other, and is difficult to categorize. But he is a mainstream member of the Impressionist group, and deserves to be reassessed. I think the other problem with him actually is that he produced a lot of work which one could perhaps categorize as pot boilers, and it's very difficult to date his work too. So there is a lot of work that still needs to be done on Guillaume. I'm not sure if I can think of any other areas particularly, but And that maybe gives you food for thought.
Well, any undergraduate or graduate student listening to either of you would do well to take the advice that you've provided. I want to turn to the questionnaire and have us sort of think about the state of the social history of art in these responses. It seems to me, when I read each and every response, that there is still a deep respect and reverence for Tim Clark, and there should be. But I think that people also address the real shortcomings of the Clarkian history of art, and I wondered why it seems that no respondent expressed any desire to abandon social history. Do you think that our field, and by that I mean Impressionist studies, has become too cautious, so that where T.J. Clark once really advocated for what I think of as an intellectual revolution in our field, that we have become tepid, that we are not willing to embrace more progressive positions? Why do you think that people still want the social history? Why does it still matter to them? And Francis or Marnan, either of you are welcome to respond first. Marnan, do you want to take that question?
Sure. I feel like I'm a bit of a biased witness on this question.
Oh, you are his student, so.
But no, one of the things I would want to say is that I think that's right about our continued interest in Clark's writing, and I think that it's the quality of the writing which draws us back to his work, especially those early books. And there's a richness there, a density, which isn't reductive to textbook social art history or social iconography. There's lots of other things going on there, including very close attention to works of art, which he's continued to develop in more recent publications, as well as a political engagement. And I think this is the elephant in the room, that social history grew out of Marxist art history and was synonymous with Marxist art history in the 1970s. And the version of social history that sort of dominates in exhibition histories in textbooks and much academic art history doesn't need to address that. I think we've transcended the Marxist origins of social art history, for better or for worse. And I think that the pitfalls of that is that it's very comfortable. I think you can do a social historical account of art in a textbook for any general public. You can do exhibitions that draw millions of people or thousands of people to a museum. It's unproblematic in its current version. So the reverence for Clark is in some senses a misreading of Clark. In a Harold Bloom sense, we're taking something from Clark that only gets part of it right. And I think that his own intellectual scholarly development indicates his frustration with that since Farewell to an Idea, his writing has not been social historical. I mean, if we lost to history his early writings, we would never call him a social historian of art. So we're being selective in our definition and in the actual practice of social history. And it's not just that Clark is interested in those sorts of political issues, but that the very term social history of art comes from Arnold Hauser, who was really explicitly engaged in a now see as a kind of reductive Marxist analysis of base and superstructure in his social history. So, part of the problem of understanding the legacy of Clark and the legacy of social history is trying to get on terms with our own definition of social history. Do we want to continue doing social iconography? Do we want it to be something else? Do we want to return to it? And I think that part of the continued interest in social history for me is its politics, that we live at a rather unfortunate crossroads in history right now, which can be quite anxiety producing for many people, and the political origins and inflections of social history in its original formation actually might be a very useful resource for thinking about our own historical moment. So I would be loath to give up on the idea that social history in some form would not be an available tool for thinking about it. The other thing I'd say is that we may be getting this whole question backwards. We're sort of posing the question as, does this method still work? Is it still something we want to use? Is it viable? What if we turn the question around and ask, what are the problems that we haven't answered? What are the questions and concerns that continue to dog us in our subfield of Impressionist studies? And how would we go about answering those? Is social history the tool that will get us an answer. How would we know beforehand if it is? There are all sorts of things that might get us to the kinds of answers that we need to find to the questions we want to pose. But if we put the problems and questions first, social history might evaporate. It might continue to be interesting, but I'm always a little reluctant to put sort of your choice of method as the first thing you ask, rather than what are you interested in, what problems do you want to solve, what questions remain out there, and then thinking about what methods would get us there.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and this was a point that I think Holly Clayson raised very well, that she doesn't define herself by, say, the field of Impressionism, but more by the questions that she asks. And so I think that there is merit to thinking about the questions first and then the appropriate methods that can be used as tools to address those questions. That's certainly true. Francis, what about you? What do you think about the future of social history and the sort of respect for T.J. Clark and unwillingness to abandon social history?
Yes, well, I suppose I'm old enough to remember the world before T.J. Clark, and I was actually brought up in a very much in this, I suppose it's that old-fashioned aesthetic way of addressing Impressionism. So I know it's possible to live without it, but I think our lives are very much enriched for it, and I now think it's actually impossible to envisage any type of approach to Impressionism which isn't seen through that lens. It's by definition we are the children of T.J. Clark. But I have one of the things I was going to say was that I've noticed a trend, and one of the anxieties that comes through it's not overstated, but in the questionnaire there's a sort of anxiety around this move away from the artist himself and the art or herself, and the artist's kind of, you can't talk about intention, but the artist's kind of own feelings about their own work, basically. And I think this is expressed by Richard Kendall, and there's one other person too who talks about this kind of recent return to a focus on techniques and materiality.
Laura Kelman.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, exactly. And I have noticed that with the kind of exhibitions that I've been working on just recently, or been asked to lend Impressionist works to, that there's an increasing trend towards artists, contemporary artists, responding to Impressionism, which is quite interesting. So, for example, we're planning a Bridget Riley exhibition in 2019, and she specifically requested to include the Sur la Lucerne painting, which is in our collection, as have it juxtaposed with her own work, because it was so important for her. And there are other artists like Peter Doig, who is again self-confessed lover of Gauguin. Gauguin in particular seems to be an artist that a number of contemporary artists have responded to. So there's another exhibition of Michael Armitage, which is planned too. He's a London-based artist, in which we are going to show, or we are hoping to show, the Gauguin vision of the sermon, which was again a specific work that he responded to. But of course, I suppose we're talking now about post-impressionism rather than impressionism. But it is an interesting trend that's taking place at the moment, I think.
Mm-hmm. So perhaps we should wrap up by maybe thinking about the takeaway from the questionnaire and the responses. When you read through everything, I think there are maybe 10 or 11 essays there. What did you learn from the other people who wrote in? What do you think people should take from this questionnaire and from the responses? Marnin, I'll start with you.
Well, both the questionnaire and this conversation has made me realize how much people do care about the social history of art. My own intellectual formation, I felt a little bit like I was a laggard or somehow old-fashioned to be still interested in the social history of art. So it's kind of encouraging to see that there are quite a number of people interested in how we might continue to do social history. The other takeaway was sort of the consistency of concerns that people have. Again, the global nature of Impressionism, market, exhibitions. These are things that I'd been interested in. I was sort of gratified to see that other people are also interested in these sorts of things. One of the takeaways I think is sort of written between the lines here is I think fairly well documented tension between the continued popularity of Impressionism for a general public and its declining significance within academic art history. I think part of, maybe this is something you can answer, Alexis, but I think part of the impetus behind this whole conversation is the perception that Impressionism is no longer a dominant subfield within art history, where it once was when Painting of Modern Life was published. I'm like, well, this is the center of everything. Impressionism, Manet, in Paris in the 19th century. Holly Clayson and Andrei Dombrowski recently published a book called "Is Paris Still the Capital of the 19th Century?" I don't know if you know, that's an open question. But part of the anxiety underlying these responses is what significance does Impressionism have for academic art history, as opposed to its obvious significance for the art market, for exhibitions, for museums, for the popular understanding of art, and so forth. I think that's something that is at stake here, and I'm not sure I have an answer to it. I don't know if social history is going to save Impressionism. I think Impressionism will survive just fine. Maybe it just won't be the center of art history anymore.
Yes, I think that you have rightly analyzed some of the anxieties that motivated this questionnaire, because I do see that there is a real rupture between what's happening in museums and exhibitions, where there is still an emphasis placed on Impressionism. And as Holly Clayson highlighted in her response, I think that the academic discourse around 19th century art has shifted to other subfields. I see that there is still an interest in visual culture, and by that I mean more popular media, prints, photography, and of course the burgeoning of film. I think that the 19th century, where it was once, I think, considered to be truly the leading subfield within art history, may now, and has often been discussed, been eclipsed by contemporary art. I think that for my part, the social history of art provides us with a truly radical political tool to discuss art. And I think that we need to remember that the social history of art is not about a simple reflection of politics, but that these artworks act as political agents to transform the people who saw and wrote about them. And that's a lesson that Clark taught me as I read the Painting of Modern Life. And that's a lesson I still think that needs to be learned in our field, that this method is a political method. It's not one that should be drained of its politics. And that's really where the motivations for this questionnaire come from for me. Yeah. Anyways, I could speak on and on about this, but Francis, for you, what is the takeaway?
Well, I would probably echo Marnin's comments, actually. I mean, there seem to be three main areas. Again, the art market. I was actually really impressed by the fact that the main kind of recommendations were very much a reflection of my own thoughts and feelings. So that the art market came up several times. Gustav Caillebotte came up several times, which was also very interesting. But so this idea of artists who would previously have been overlooked. So that the way also should be made clear for artists like Raffaelli and Guillaumin, who still remain to be explored in more detail. And then also these kind of wider, more global impressionisms, not just kind of the periphery of Europe, but also farther afield. And I suppose we're not just talking about Australian impressionism, but we're, so someone mentioned South America, and there are infinite possibilities, and also to explore these kind of impressionisms using social art history to refresh them and invigorate them. I think my experience with American impressionism has been quite interesting, because there are a number of scholars that work on American impressionism. They tend to all live in America, and they have applied T.J. Clarke's methods, but it's actually quite a difficult thing to do, because these artists didn't necessarily have they weren't living in the same world as the French Impressionists, and so you have to kind of reassess. You have to shift your ground a little bit in order to apply the same methodologies. But certainly T.J. Clarke's had a huge impact again on the way that British art historians focus on this period. I noticed, for example, Anna Robbins, who's one of the contributors to the questionnaire, she's really refreshed impressionist, British impressionist studies in her own approach, which is very much a social art history approach. Yes, I mean, I suppose the last thing I should say is you addressed this idea of exhibitions, and it is quite astonishing how this impressionist kind of or how the public still responds very positively to an impressionist exhibition. An example is the Monet exhibition at the Grand Palais in 2010, I think it was, attracted nearly 1 million visitors. So impressionism certainly hasn't died, but there is, when I think about the enthusiasm of my own students, they are not responding the same way to mainstream impressionism. They're much more interested in kind of possibly later movements of the late 19th century symbolism, decadence, and in some ways impressionism is becoming kind of slightly passé, certainly out of fashion, but it continues to fascinate the critics and the museum goer. So I'm not quite sure what we should do to sort of bring the two together again. It's a conundrum.
Yes, that's where we end with that conundrum. I want to thank you both for participating in this discussion, and I want to thank all of our respondents to the questionnaire for their essays. And I hope that everyone enjoys reading and listening. Thank you.